Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. But at the same time, you know what I was thinking about when I was watching this game? I'll give credit where it's due. I was thinking about something that John Neighbors said on this show last week when we had him on as a guest. He said, Torres, I'm not saying we're going to win. And to be clear, I don't think John predicted Arkansas to win. But he goes, there's no pressure on Cal. His fan base doesn't think he's going to win. The Kentucky fans don't think he's going to win. The media doesn't think he's going to win. And he said there's no players on Kentucky. There's no pressure on Kentucky's players as well. I mean, they weren't there last year, whatever. But there is a lot of pressure on Mark Pope. You know, we clipped off the segment with John Neighbors, and the headline was, all the pressure is on Mark Pope. I think people didn't really understand why that would be. Well, I'll tell you what, after the loss to Arkansas on Saturday, it feels like that was the first time that questions aren't the right word about Mark Pope, but beyond frustration, visceral public frustration. By the way, I will never criticize any fan for being vocal. I always say, just don't post home addresses. Don't make threats to your coach. But if you want to express being mad, that's part of being a fan. And it felt like that was the first time in a long time, maybe of the Pope era, that people were genuinely frustrated. You go back to the Alabama game. Alabama's great. You go back to, the Vandy game. Kentucky's banged up. Well, last night was frustrating. I thought it was encapsulated by a tweet from Matt Jones, Kentucky Sports Radio. Producer Matt, if we have that, you can go ahead and pop it up. Matt Jones, KY Sports Radio, tweeted, quote, "It's embarrassing to lose a game to a 1-6 SEC team at home. It just is. Throw in the Calipari factor, and it's a pretty terrible loss. A lot of really good Pope wins this year, but this definitely is a massive clunker." So listen, I know some people love Matt. Some people hate Matt. Matt's another person that's always been good to me. But he is the voice of a lot of people in that state, and it felt like this was the first time that it's like, man, we had hope in Pope, but we are frustrated. So let's go ahead and dive in, because I do think, to be fair, there are reasons to be frustrated. I think there are also reasons that we have to be realistic about why we got the result that we did on Saturday evening. So first off, first of all, let me say this, and this isn't even necessarily a blame. First of all, I'll get to that in a minute. We do have to be fair to Mark Pope, though, okay? We do have to be fair. We do have to say that, if we're going to say, Arkansas did it with only 8 scholarship players, essentially, we have to acknowledge that Kentucky is really, really, really banged up right now, okay? And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Lamont Butler, your starting point guard, is out right now. Now, Pope had some interesting comments after the game that seemed to indicate that he might not be close to coming back. I don't get the sense that it's that bad. Yes, I know I've said publicly on this show that I've known the family for a long time. I don't have any personal insight into Lamont's injury status. Everybody's being kind of quiet right now about what, just how healthy he is, when he'll be back. I don't think it's season ending or whatever, but he wasn't available on Saturday. Kirk Risa, the backup point guard, wasn't available on Saturday. Andrew Carr played probably the most he's played in about 3 or 4 weeks, but he's clearly not 100%. And so we have to acknowledge it. By the way, again, I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that I thought that Kentucky was going to lose this game. But what I will say, and we talked about it on the show on Friday, is like, I thought Tennessee, it was a calculated mistake. They kind of let Kentucky just walk the ball up, get into their offense before they started playing defense. I said, Cal's got this smaller lineup. He's been pressuring more. Can you force some turnovers? Can you make Kentucky uncomfortable? Can you get them out of their rhythm? And I think to a degree they did that. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that it was like, a brilliant defensive effort. I mean, Kentucky did still put up 79 points in this game, but I thought there was a pathway, and I do think we have to acknowledge there were injuries. I also think we have to acknowledge, as great of a moment as it was for Coach Cal, it was relatively fluky. I'm just going to say it. We got Arkansas fans in the chat. If you want to get mad at me, I totally get it. But at the same time, it's like, Arkansas was a 31 or so % three-point shooting team coming into this game. They hit 13 of 25 on Saturday night. Guys that haven't been hitting them all year, or guys that haven't been consistent all year, you basically got, and again, I think it's part of the hype of the game, you basically got the best version of essentially everybody on that Arkansas roster, except maybe Jonas Adu, who's still clearly not healthy. But that was the best game Janelle Davis played all year. Carter Knox was phenomenal. Adu, the three former Kentucky guys were phenomenal. So these are all factors. My buddy Colin Cowherd says this all the time. There's a difference between excuses and reasons, okay? My dog ate my homework is an excuse. I think there are legitimate reasons why Kentucky lost this game. Out-of-body experience for Arkansas. You're banged up. I'll also add this too, and I don't know if I said this on this show or, I did so many interviews last week, but I did wonder, the mental makeup of Kentucky players versus Arkansas players coming in. I remember previewing the Tennessee-Kentucky game earlier in the week, and I said, look, I don't think Kentucky players are going to be looking ahead to Arkansas because to them, it's just another game on the schedule. Now, Mark Pope knows how big of a deal it is. The fans know how big of a deal it is. But it's, if you're Jackson Robinson and you were playing at BYU last year, I know he played at Arkansas early in his career, but is it a bigger game for them than Tennessee was or than Gonzaga was or than Duke was? Same with whoever, Otega Oweh, on and on and on and on and on. So again, I'm not making excuses for Mark Pope. I'm trying to make, explain reasons. But I'd counter that by saying the effort wasn't good enough. And there is frustration with the fan base. I totally get it. And I think a lot of it is completely justified. In terms of why, first of all, I just don't think, the effort, not only defensively, but I just thought the effort to start the game was okay. But Arkansas was better. I mean, Arkansas was flying all over the court. Arkansas, a team that isn't very big, basically it was essentially the exact same rebounding situation. I know Kentucky isn't the biggest team either, but, Arkansas struggled on the boards. It was basically even rebounding. The effort wasn't great to start, okay? I think beyond that, two things. One, the defense just has to be better. And listen, you guys know, I'm not X's and O's guy. I'm not going to sit here and say, in ball screen coverage, they have to do, dude, stop. I think there's too many nerds on social media that think they have all the answers. It's like, no, I do trust the basketball people to figure out the basketball stuff. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I have all the answers as to what's going on defense. But I'll say this. There was a lot of people in the chat earlier in the show that were like, we should not be practicing offense the rest of the year. The defense has to get better. And I do think this is just a concerning trend for this team that at this point, it's beyond a trend. I mean, just look at the stats from the season. If you want to argue that Arkansas had an out-of-body experience that they might not have the rest of the year, they scored 87 points and they've scored fewer than 70 in basically every other SEC game except for one, okay? But even if you want to argue that Arkansas had an out-of-body experience, well, you gave up 89 to Gonzaga in overtime. You gave up to open SEC play 100 at home to Florida. You gave up 90 to Mississippi State. You gave up 102 to Alabama. You gave up 74 to Vanderbilt. And so all these situations are different. And listen, you're facing some of the great offenses in all of college basketball, Alabama, Florida, whatever. But Florida ain't the, 2016 Golden State Warriors either. They scored 44 points at Tennessee on Saturday. And so the defense has been not great, inconsistent. And I'll say this, it's not really that you really don't have the players. I remember Mark Pope kind of bragging in the preseason, like, Lamont Butler and Otega Oweh and Amari Williams are all fighting at practice over who's going to end up winning SEC Defensive Player of the Year. So if you have an elite on-the-ball guard who I understand wasn't available, if you have an elite big defensively, if you have Otega Oweh who should be special on the wing, you have to perform better. Again, I thought the rebounding was fine, but could have been better. But I'll also say this. I do just think there have been too many times throughout the season where the effort just simply was not good enough over the course of a game, where you simply showed up either not ready to play or the other team showed up with more juice than you. That's just the fact. It's the bottom line. You can argue me, you can fight it, but it's the truth. I mean, again, and I think it really, to me, is, again, the reasons versus excuses thing. We've made excuses maybe for past lack of effort. Oh, against Ohio State, you lose that game. Well, it's right before Christmas and, you're up there for a few days and whatever. Didn't show up ready to play. I wouldn't say the Clemson loss was one that they weren't ready to play. But, listen, the Georgia loss, I don't think they showed up to Georgia ready to play. Listen, Georgia's fine. But I said at the time, because people were like, oh, they're going to be ranked next week. I'm like, Georgia's not good. Stop. Georgia's not an elite SEC team. Mike White is not an elite SEC coach. Like, listen, you start ranking SEC coaches, Mike White's in the bottom 2, bottom 3 right now. So the effort was not great against Georgia. The effort was not great against Ohio State. And I'll take it a step further. Like even the Vandy loss a few days ago, you don't want to oversell it because clearly Lamont Butler was hurt. But the counter to that was that, you were getting blown out in the first half before you made a run to start the second half. And so, listen, I don't want to dismiss the highs because the one thing I will say about Pope, he is great in big games and big moments, having his team ready to go. Phenomenal against Tennessee. Phenomenal. There's no other way to put it. Mississippi State, you gave up 90, but you were ready to play. Alabama, you lost, but you were ready to play. Florida, you won, but you were ready to play. But there are just these games where his team does not show up ready to go. Georgia, Ohio State. I think Arkansas, even though you scored 79 points, I don't think you were ready to play. And so Kentucky fans, and I'll be curious, maybe we get to a comment or two here, Matt. I'll just say I do understand the frustration. This was a situation where, again, and here's the other thing. Let me even backtrack to something I said a minute ago, okay? If your argument is that, which I just made, is that the players maybe don't fully understand how big of a game this is, well, guess what? You got to make them know, and you got to make them learn. You got to make them say, hey, listen, we understand that you just played Tennessee, and this league is so tough, and it's so good, and that's such a great win. But we have to move on to the next one because the people in this state, the people that are going to be in the building, this game matters to them. You know those like cliches, which I always thought were kind of stupid, of like, I'd rather beat my rival and win every other game than win a national championship and lose to my rival. That's kind of a stupid thing to always say, right? Like Ohio State kind of proved this year, like, yeah, it kind of sucks to lose to Michigan, but we'll take that natty. We're not giving that trophy back. But I do think this was one that you just had to win. And if the players don't fully understand that, you have to explain it to them so they do understand it, because the emotion was high, the interest was high. Listen, we could argue about the college game day stuff, but it was clear that they made a colossal mistake because the atmosphere for this game was unlike any maybe we've seen in college basketball, not only this season, but pretty much over the last 7, 8, 9 years. So listen, this isn't the whole like cope with Pope, he's no good. No, you got 5 wins over ranked teams. You've beaten Duke, which is a great win. You've beaten Tennessee on the road, but you have some really bad losses as well. And I think lastly, I think sometimes we overrate things in the moment, but that is a loss that could have long-term consequences, for NCAA tournament seeding perspective. I mean, Kentucky was one of the few teams that has had coming in a bunch of quad 1 wins and no quad 2, 3 losses. That's a quad 2 loss. And listen, now you know what's crazy? You kind of got to root for Arkansas because you got to hope that win gets better as time goes on, not worse. So listen, I'm not ready to throw in the towel on Pope. I'm not ready to do the cope with Pope. I still think he's great. I still have hope in Pope, as the t-shirt says, but I do understand any Kentucky fan that is frustrated today.